You are. Now, I think the best way that Canada can leverage this is in processing, and this is specifically Alberta. You've got the land, you've got the green space, and especially in Alberta, you've got the cheap electricity and the cheap energy. And that is the big hole that we have in the midterm. Now, the Gulf Coast is going to do everything they can to dominate this, but there's plenty of room for materials processing in Alberta, and I think you really need to take advantage of that. Beyond that, if you want to go into manufacturing, I'm not sure automotive is the greatest place for you to compete overall because you don't have proximate centers to synergize with. But the more advanced components, the ones that are very high value added, the ones where transport is a minuscule, if not a rounding error to zero, part of the value. Basically, if the part can be flown to its assembly location in an economically viable manner, that's where you can play. I'm not sure you can do that in automotives or EVs, but I bet you can do that in aerospace and electronics. There was a joke that went around American political circles in the 90s that with the end of the Cold War, New Zealand joined the non-aligned movement and Canada just became an NGO.
I haven't heard that one, but I understand it.
Even if Canada could function as a normal, unified, federal or unitary system, and it can't, even if it could, the shape of Canada, the size of Canada, the fact that it has an Atlantic and a Pacific frontage that are so separated economically, strategically, and culturally, you couldn't play. Because if you can't provide the base security, none of the rest of it works. Now, post-World War II, pre-Ukraine Canadian policy piggybacked on global safety to push development goals and economic development and trade access. And in that, you were a middle power. But it was because of an environment that you could not create or shape. That environment is now gone, and so you would have to create or shape it yourself. You don't have the capacity. You're too far away, you're too split, you're too small. I'd argue the United States doesn't have that capacity to do it at scale on a global basis.
Wow.
We are going to have to choose. Now, the fact that Japan has decided to fuse with American power is a huge step in helping that work in different areas. But I think
Especially
Southeast
naval
Asia,
power. Yeah.
I think Southeast Asia, Northern Europe, specifically Scandinavia, again in partnership with the Brits, and maybe a degree of the Western Hemisphere in general, I think that's what we are going to be limited to. So within that pond, Canada can do a lot. But in addition to making friends with Washington, I would make friends with Tokyo, because if you're looking for something that's a little bit not the United States,
Right.
that's really the only option on deck until such time as the Brits kind of finally figure out what Brexit means.
So over and above that, making friends with Tokyo, I'll ask you another advice question. If you're advising the Prime Minister of Canada, if you don't think we can play as a middle power, how do you think we should play?
This, again, is not going to be a very friendly answer. Every Canadian province trades more with the United States than it does with the rest of the world. That will not change this century. I realize that the primary Canadian cultural identifier is that we're not American. I get it. I understand it.
Even though like 80% of us live, within a
within
2-hour
sight
drive.
of the border. Yeah. I would say that the best way, if the goal is to maintain a little bit of light between the United States and Canada, and I understand why that is, the only place you can play is finance. Your energy goes south, your food processing largely goes through American ports. There's really not another player here, and your trade is dependent on American security. But there's a lot of money that's really scared from the rest of the world that is looking for a place to call home. And until recently, all of it that comes to Canada has been going into housing, and you need to redirect that somewhere else.
Right.
So
huge housing affordability issues in Canada at the moment. Yeah.
Now,
particularly in our gateway cities. Yeah.
The foreigners who are doing this, they're scared they're going to lose everything, and it's a reasonable fear. And they would prefer a hard asset, a rate of return, and an implicit government guarantee, and housing checks 2 of the 3 boxes. So your goal is to create a financial product that checks 3 boxes, called a community development bond. We're moving into an environment where capital is going to be harder to get. And if you can find a way to funnel stupid, scared capital into more productive uses, that will make Canada awash with foreign money that doesn't really care what its rate of return is. Because if they get half of it back after 10 years, that means they got half their money out. They call that a win.
Better than zero.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you can get the foreigners to pay for your own system, that's the way forward here. And that is the big outsized win for Canada to become, I don't want to call them money launderers to the stars or anything like that.
No, I don't think that should be the tagline.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But you could put it to more productive use than it can if it just goes into housing.
Well, that brings me to the last thing I have time to ask you today, which is about inflation. Because, if we were to survey, in fact, we regularly do, the folks that live in Alberta and Calgary and Canada, I can tell you what's coming up at the top of their concern list. It's affordability, particularly inflation, and how interest rates interact with that as well. Now, there's this feeling of hopefulness that perhaps the period of inflation is mostly behind us, the pain is mostly behind us, and the interest rates will start to come down relatively rapidly. Do you share that view?
No. In the United States, we're not going to see rates come down for another decade. We have to wait for another generation to become capital rich. Those will be the millennials. Basically, what's happening in the United States is the boomers are retiring. They're taking all their money with them. And even if interest rates were able to come down, capital costs really wouldn't. We have to wait for more people to enter their 50s. That means 2030 to 2035 is when we see the break. Canada's inflation is coming from two sources. Number one is the property market. There's no reason to expect that to get better except for this ban on foreign purchases. The foreigners are going to find more and more creative ways to get around that. And so the policy will have to continually be updated to keep that under control. But the second reason you've been dealing with inflationary issues is COVID. From the point that a demand profile shifts, whether it's because of a lockdown or a new vaccine makes it possible to open, or the anti-vaxxers throw a fit, or the anti-vaxxers all get put in prison, whatever it happens to be. It takes about 18 months for the supply chains to match the new demand profile. And in the United States and Canada, it was 18 months ago that we started our opening. So we're finally getting to the end of the COVID impact. And so yes, you're seeing disinflation now as the supply chains are finally repaired. What I see coming is disruptions that are far more serious, not in demand, but in supply.
Right.
Materials out of Russia, energy out of Russia, finished goods out of China. All of this is going to hit us over the next few years.
And typically supply-driven inflation is way harder to
Much
address.
harder to fix because
much
you
less
have to build
transitory.
fundamentally new industrial plant in different locations, or rebuild them from the ground up. Now, we will do that in North America. We will double the size of the industrial plant, but it will take us 5 years. And in that 5-year period, we will have inflation of 9 to 15% per annum. But it's not because we don't have stuff. It's because we're building the ability to have stuff. And it will be rampant economic growth to be paired with that inflation. So it'll hurt, but at the end of it, we will have a supply chain system that is simpler, cleaner, more energy efficient, that employs people on the continent to sell people to the continent, that is immune to things that happen beyond the continent. This is a good story, but it's not a straight line, and it is bumpy.